Well, I'm not going to introduce our visitor because there's someone here who knows him much better than I do, which is Marcus. I think all of you know Marcus, I hope. Yeah? Most of you? So Marcus, can you actually come up and introduce Jim, and then we can jump straight in.
Afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
Good to be here today, together with Jim Harries, friend and colleague of mine. We've journeyed together for the last 12, 13 years. I myself, I'm not sure whether I've met all of you, but I've been here before. Those who don't know me, I'm from Germany, and I came to South Africa with my family 8 years ago, doing my own studies and research here over the last years. And I think if it had not been for Jim and his ministry that he'll tell us about, I would probably not have learned Xhosa. But he's had quite some influence on my life and my work over the last years, especially through the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission that he established with other people some years ago, that emphasizes, especially for those coming from Western contexts working in the majority world, to use the languages of the people they're working with and the resources they have at their disposal. So Jim is from the UK originally. His mother is German, that's why we tend to speak German with each other. But he grew up in the UK and has worked in Africa, first in Zambia, then in Kenya for more than 35 years now, I think. And yeah, he will tell us about the details of that in a moment, share about his ministry and what God called him to do in this, the service in rural African context.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for that introduction, and I'm very grateful to Marcus for having made it possible for me to spend just over 2 weeks in Cape Town with different engagements. This one starting this week, God willing, going back to Kenya Thursday evening. So very grateful, and grateful for the college opening their doors to me. I actually taught part-time for 15 years at a college, maybe a bit like yours. We didn't have master's level, but we had diploma and undergraduate degrees there in Kenya. And so I feel like I'm back in kind of familiar context in that respect. So Marcus told you a little bit about myself, which I guess I'll add to that as we go along. And if you have questions that we'll keep, then keep your questions for afterwards. If you think what I've said is really bad, you put up your hand or march forward and grab me by the throat. So the title I have for today is Jesus Retreated Alone So as Not to be Made King. John 6:15. Truly holistic intercultural mission from personal experience. So John 6:15. Now this is not going to be like a theology lesson, I don't think. But hopefully the George Whitefield theologians won't fault me on my theological insights. It says the following: Jesus, this NIV, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. He was concerned people were going to give him too much authority, or the wrong kind of authority. King. What is it to be a king? Well, obviously there's something undesirable about it. Why did they want to make him king? Well, he was doing a risky thing. He was illustrating a spiritual truth with food distribution. He used food distribution to illustrate a spiritual truth. What was the food distribution? Well, those who know John 6, of course, the feeding of the 5,000. what was a spiritual truth, well, actually, you should be eating my body and drinking my blood. But people followed him because they realized that he was giving out food. Anybody here like food? You South Africans are as bad as us in Kenya. Maybe this is a lesson to say, be very careful before you get involved in distribution of resources. I'll come back to that passage at the end. A few things to say. My experiences in East Africa and Zambia before that. Now, I'm not all that familiar with South Africa. So if I say the wrong thing in the wrong place in the wrong way, please forgive me. And I hope that East African context will give us some insights valuable to wherever we are. Now, I've just met a South Sudanese I didn't get his name, who's lived in Kenya, so we have people from different parts of Africa I'm seeing. Second thing I can say, I don't like at all engaging African people using English. I think it's a kind of a hopeless exercise. It's a trap. It's so easily set in English. So my work in Kenya, I engage using Swahili and Luo. Now, I did teach at this English language college for 15 years part-time, and the more I learned Swahili, the more difficult it was for me to carry on teaching in English, when I would much rather have connected with people using Swahili. So in a sense, when I ceased to teach there, I was glad, because it gave me more time to work with the indigenous people in their own churches and communities. English, I appreciate, it's a terrible, perhaps, catch-22. You have to have it these days to get anywhere, in inverted commas. But yet, it doesn't have roots in African ways of living or in African ways of thinking. So the issue of language obviously never kind of ends. Let me just briefly illustrate some of the difficulties I think we face when we use European languages in Africa. Has anybody ever heard of a sport called tennis? Have you heard of tennis? Ah, yes. Soccer or football. Right, you're knowledgeable people. This is great. Now, if I said which is best, you might have an opinion, but really they're different sports. And I wonder if the different sports are a little like different cultures, like African culture, as against, well, you know, some people, if you say African, they think, you neo-colonialist, Africa's not a country. I do think some of the opposition to generalization that goes on in academic circles is a bit misguided. If you want to ask more about that later, you can. So African circles or Kenyan circles and British circles. So let's say Kenyans play soccer and Brits play tennis. Okay? Now, we are now required to use tennis language to describe soccer. So, what is a free kick in tennis? Any volunteers? Serve, probably, yeah. But you can see what that translation is doing, can't you? What is a throw-in in tennis? What's a throw-in in tennis? What's offside in tennis? Now, I thought maybe offside is when you're too far from the net. What is a goal in tennis? I think it's the ball going over the net. In soccer, the aim is to get the ball into the net, but in tennis, the aim is to get the ball over the net. So if indeed tennis and soccer are illustrations of cultures, and the contrast between them is as different as that of cultures, you can see what happens when you use English in order to engage theology in African contexts. So hence, I say I prefer not to do so, but I was happy to accept this lecture, so I'm a hypocrite, I guess. Okay, let's think about that, and if you want to ask more questions, you can. A few other background issues. I think another thing we need to be aware of, frankly, these days, is the West does its utmost to not credit Christianity for anything. And the West, of course, controls English. You know, English is a British and American language, and they don't want the gospel to get the credit. So many people have this drummed in their ears all the time, basically a silence on the gospel, not because the Bible doesn't do amazing things in people's lives, but because the Western ideology requires the Bible to be useless. Something else to bear in mind. Another thing to mention, dualism. I don't know if that's a topic on your curriculum. Blank looks. Let me suggest that English has dualistic roots, and Western people live in a dualistic way. So you may be asking, what do you mean by that? Well, they draw a category boundary between things, material, the physical, and the spiritual. So the drawing of that category boundary results in a term like supernatural. Now, I've heard and read many African theologians use the term supernatural, and I wonder how they're comprehending it. The translation in Swahili is muujiza, which is something like amazing. Now, supernatural presupposes two categories, the natural category and the supernatural category. But are African people dualist, or are they not dualist? Now, in my experience in Africa, people take everything as a one. So that has many ramifications, like if you receive a spiritual blessing, you expect it to have a physical manifestation. Except I'm describing them as two things. They are inseparable in the African world feel. Now again, you can come back to me and say you're terrible at saying Africans have a world feel, because in English we talk about a world view. But actually, I think feelings are more important than views. You might have a wonderful view, but if you feel bad, you're not going to enjoy it. And I think many of our African brothers and sisters concentrate more on the feel than the view. So this dualism has many ramifications. Coming from the UK, generally we think that salvation is spiritual, and then it affects the material. Whereas in many African contexts, people expect the salvation to bring material as well as spiritual. Now, you can call that the prosperity gospel. And we say the prosperity gospel is wrong, and when you try to say that in African languages, it gets more difficult. Although, I mean, like we have Injili ya ufanisi kwa Kiswahili, okay, so there's a term there used to translate the English, but in people's minds, of course, my relationship with God being good will result in me thriving, is kind of the default position. Finally, by way of background, perhaps another thing to bear in mind, now this gets a bit sensitive, but treating Africans like Africans can be illegal. And that is something very striking and very extraordinary, but there it is. One has to be careful to presuppose essentially everyone in the world to be American in culture. Now, an example of that, I was in a university in Nairobi in Kenya. I don't visit these universities often, but I heard a speaker telling us at the Christian Union, there's about 700 students, and this speaker telling us that these days many young couples were living together without marrying. And all his statistics came from the USA. But of course, the assumption was that what we were doing in Kenya is exactly what was being reported from the USA. And to critique that and to suggest otherwise could get you into trouble. Now, Marcus has introduced the theme that I want to bring today, particularly, which we call vulnerable mission, which has two constituent parts, if you like. We advocate that some Western missionaries use African languages and local resources entirely in their key ministry. Now note, I'm not here specifically addressing African missionaries. Why? Well, I don't understand the African folks in Kenya so well, so I'm really focusing on communicating to my people and trying to get them to understand, which is difficult enough in itself. And saying to them that some of you should use entirely African languages when you do your ministry in Africa, and those some ought not to use outside resources, ought not to invest outside resources into their ministry. Which is not to say that you don't have outside resources or you don't use them somewhere, but you may use them somewhere other than in your ministry. So if I was going to do ministry with people on this side of the room, then I would give all my money to people on this side of the room. Get the idea? If I had a lot of money, like someone said, Jim, here's $100,000 for the poor in Africa, I give it to these people, and then I'd minister with you. Why? No response. There's something in England called buying your friends. Buying your friends. Because as soon as you start being responsible for people's livelihood, then people are inclined to say yes to you, no matter what the question is or what the issue is. So rather than obliging people to say yes, give your money somewhere else, and the people you minister with are free to say, you don't know what you're talking about, or you are wrong, and the answer is no. But if you give to the people you're serving, then you go into a kind of a patron-client situation where they will be inclined to give you the answer you're looking for, even if it's not actually the most helpful one. Talk a little bit about myself. As Marcus mentioned, I was born and raised in the UK and actually loved agriculture. So I was studying agriculture, and as I was doing so, we had a large number of speakers come to our Christian group in the college who had overseas experience. So they would tell us, you people who know how to grow food, why don't you go to places where food is in short supply instead of helping England grow more food? And already there is so much food in England. So this challenge came to me and again, and I considered I wasn't up to that kind of work. So I said, no, not for me. But eventually, this was in 1987, I believe the Lord said, yes, give yourself in service to me. And he also was saying, it's either life or not at all. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but there is this thing, short-term mission. And some people use short-term mission to try out their calling, you know. So if I'm called to do mission in Cape Town, I come here for a year, and if I have a good time, I'll carry on. If I have a bad time, well, I'm going to go away. But then are we obliging God to give us a good time so that we serve him? Is that not good, putting God to the test? So to me, I had to make the decision to give my life before I ever left the UK and entered into service. And it's by God's grace. I mean, who can imagine after 36 years, I'm still doing God's work in Africa, other than because of his grace and his love. Now, I got to Zambia then in 1988. Now, of course, there's many things I could say, but for a limited time, let me say, when I arrived, it's like they'd forgotten I was coming. There was no housing for me, but they took me to the secondary school I was going to teach at, and there was an African, a Zambian, living in a big house by himself. So I said, Jim's going to live with you. So from the start, I was put there with a Zambian, which doesn't usually happen according to that mission policy, at least as I understand it. His name was Goliath. He was a titchy little fellow. Maybe you mothers should give your children names when they're big, not when they're small, otherwise they don't fit to the name. Anyway, being as I shared a house with him, I spent a lot of time with Goliath, and different times we'd be invited by the missionaries with Goliath to go and visit them for a meal and everything. Goliath, though, walked incredibly slowly. I like walking really fast, but I'd have to keep down with Goliath. But anyway, one way and another, we had a relationship, and one thing I used to notice about Goliath is that he seemed to avoid spending a lot of time with American and British missionaries. So one day I asked him about this: why don't you spend more time? Why do you seem to avoid spending time with those folks? Now, I'm not implying that this is the case in South Africa, but this may be the case in East Africa. He gave an answer something like this: because when my people see me with white folks, they assume I'm after their money, and this ruins my reputation amongst my people. Now, that response of him kind of blew me. You mean, whenever I come near an African, I'm spoiling their reputation, simply on account of the fact that I'm of European origin, and those of us who come from Europe are known as for having a lot of money and being liberal in our use of money and distribution of money. So I thought, well, if I'm going to make close friendships with Africans, I've got to not have money, or they'll avoid me, or I'll spoil them. Now, at the time I was doing agricultural projects and was very keen to use my experience at the secondary school to gain insights that will then help me to help folks in the community grow more food. When I discussed this with people, usually they were very keen on whatever proposal I was making. Maybe fertilizer, maybe it was a certain machine, or hybrid chickens or pigs or whatever it was. But then I also realized that every project that I could bring to the people required me to invest money into it. And if you think about the economics of it, it was very clear to the people I was speaking to that whatever project I was going to bring was going to benefit them. So of course they said, yes, good project. And if they said, no, we don't want that project, and I took it to the village next door, well, that would be terrible. They'd look like the fools. So I realized that they really were not discerning at all regarding my proposals to them, because in every case they were going to get wealthier as a result of what I was proposing. So how do I get to know what those Zambian people were actually thinking? Well, again, I had to have no money, which meant basically no project, or a project that had no money attached. Another thing that very much challenged me, that I hadn't expected before coming to Zambia. I thought that Africans and Europeans worked like this, but I discovered there's often a line between them, particularly in living circumstances. So the missionaries would live in the missionary houses, and the Africans would live wherever they were living. But I thought, are we so different that we cannot live together? So one challenge I took to heart was to say, there needs to be a European who makes the effort at actually living with the African people. I was single. I'm still single, by the way. I don't say that because there might be single girls who are interested. I'm leaving today anyway, so, I mean, this is the trouble with talking about singleness, but there you go. It's who I am. I won't take that further. And I say that because it's very much more difficult for a married couple to adjust to a different way of life, to a different culture. The expectations of the wife, particularly the expectations of living standard, like warm water to wash your hair, the right kind of food requires a lot of money. But for me as a single man, I can fit in with the African context. And that's what I did when arriving in Kenya in 1993. I landed in a village. I knew one person in hundreds of miles, and that was in, some of you probably heard of Barack Obama. What's his tribe? Yes, great, okay. So I'm with the Luo people in Kenya. Barack Obama's home is about half an hour's drive from where I'm staying, so I'm really quite famous. If you want to visit me, you can go and visit his home. I landed in the African village, alone as a European. And for various reasons, the door to Zambia closed. Some people were doubting the idea that actually it's best to live with the people. Because if you live close to the people, I can remember actually this American missionary explaining, you won't have that opportunity to run your projects. But I thought, no, what people need in the end is not projects, it's the gospel. By this time I'd left agriculture aside, and the gospel is communicated by someone who's vulnerable to them, who can live proximally, and by living proximally, learn how to live as a Luo, for example. So I actually was 29 years old, and in many respects lived in the home of this African bishop like a child. And sometimes I would get a bit frustrated, but I thought, well, if I tell him, don't treat me like this, I mean, I wanted to be there. I could leave, but I wanted to stay in this African home as a child so as to learn how to function in an African home. Now, just one example, in the UK, frequently, if someone comes to your door, they knock on the door, and you go and you open the door and you say, yes, what do you want? Now, that in Kenya is extremely rude. You just say, come in, and the person comes in and sits down. And then they may not actually say what they want until they say, utanishindikiza, will you accompany me? And then they tell you what they want when you leave. Right. A simple thing, but an important lesson. Now, that had problems for me. I remember when I was at the American mission station, and I went to visit an American missionary, and he stood in the door. I pushed my way past him. It was so rude to me to stand in the doorway. And then he reported to the principal and said, Jim came to my house, he pushed his way into my house. So learning how to function in African community. Another example, I do look after children in my home. I don't have a home for children, right? The children live in my home. I don't have an orphanage. And what I do is not government recognized and so on. But children live with me, orphan children basically. There's also a house mother there who's responsible for them. So on this occasion, my pastor, my Kenyan pastor, was there, and we were talking. Now, I didn't notice anything amiss. Later, he said to the children, you did a very bad thing. The old people were talking, and you were making a noise. Make sure, if old people are talking, that you're far away. Now, I didn't think they were upsetting anything at all, and I was quite happy that they were in the vicinity. But I thought, no, if this is what the Kenyan pastor says, this is what we do. Children should not make a noise if they're older people talking. And if they do, that's offensive. So that is kind of the rule of my home, in the same rule as other people have in their homes, if you like. Now, of course, if you're going to live with people, my home languages are Luo and Swahili, then you get maximum opportunity for language learning. You don't go to a class for an hour in the day, but afternoon, evening, morning, midday, it's always Luo, 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 Luo. And Swahili, we also use Swahili at home. So I don't think I'm good at learning language, but it's just that I put myself into a position where I was constantly exposed to those languages. And then I also realized something else. Now, take this as you can, but what do you then do outside of your home? Now, sometimes in Western Kenya, where I am, people come and they talk to me in English. And they're expecting me to respond in English. But I don't. I don't see how I can. The alternative would be, when I'm with the African community, to look at somebody and say, you look intelligent, and speak to her in English. And look at somebody else and say, you don't look intelligent, and speak to them in Luo. In other words, every time I meet someone, I don't have to make a judgment call. Because English is a language of money and education, yes? So intelligent, clever, wealthy people know English, and stupid villagers don't. So I can't do that. I have to use Luo with everybody. So these days in Kenya, that's what I do. When people speak to me in English, I respond in Swahili, I respond in Luo. If they carry on in English, I carry on responding in Luo and Swahili. Because it may not be a problem for them, but it's a problem for me if I now have to if someone who I always speak with in Lourdes hears me speak to someone else in English, they say, why do you despise me? So one must quickly get to a position where one exclusively uses an African language. Now, another illustration of the kind of dilemmas that we face, widows at one time quite frequently came to me for help. And when a widow comes, I mean, I often don't doubt the story. Her husband died 2 years ago. She has 4 children. She hasn't got the money to repair the house. She hasn't got the school fees and so on. Now she's coming to me for help. So, okay, the widow comes, I give her $100 because I'm really touched. And then another widow comes 2 days later and tells me her story. I give her $20. Widows talk to each other. Yeah, Jim really likes you. I'm in trouble. So this issue of being generous to people who ask for help is very difficult. Now, what I would propose is not that nobody helps anybody, but that you either divide where you help or where you don't. As in my case, the children I look after clothing, food, school, but other people who come to me for money, I don't give them any, because of these tensions that would arise, and my identity as a donor would mean the answer is always yes, and so on and so forth. So also, what we're proposing is that some missionaries work entirely using indigenous resources, so that eventually you can actually meet people who know you and money doesn't come into their head. Now, I don't want to offend anyone in South Africa. I don't know South Africa. But in the context I'm often in East Africa, when people see me and my strange skin color, they think this man's got a lot of money, and that's their approach, trying to get some of that money. So we founded Extension Bible Teaching Program. Yala Theological Center. Yala's the name of the township there, small town there. And I taught part-time at that for 18 years. We taught in Luo and we taught in Swahili. And it wasn't only me teaching, we had a number of African folks teaching who we would also help part-time going to Bible school so they could continue teaching. It was incredibly discouraging occupation, because when we went, say, to a church and we said, we want to open a Bible class here, how many people will come? Everyone puts up their hand, we will come. We'd have the first class on one day, an afternoon in that week, and we'd have maybe 20 people show up, and they didn't get anything. The next week there's 8 people. The next week there's 7 people coming half an hour late, until after about 2 months we hit 0. Well, actually it makes a lot of sense, because as I indicated, in African understanding, spiritual blessing has to come with material blessing. And if I wasn't going to give them any money or any prospect of material blessing, because they could talk to other people, yeah, Jim opened a class in our church and 2 months later we had nothing, forget it. So the Bible teaching program kind of went like this, some very good times, and eventually in 2011 I kind of allowed it to die, because no one wanted it. Now, related to that is the fact that the director of the program was someone that people didn't like all that much, and all those who didn't like him, they thought he was getting a lot of money from me, so of course they also absented themselves. So these issues, very difficult. The second one I touched on there, I'll come back to, which is envy. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that I'm very grateful that the American Mission took me on teaching part-time at their Bible school. At that time, this was from 1996, it was very, very helpful to me. I began, while I was progressing in my learning of Swahili, which in East Africa is very widely known. So often I'd have a class with entirely Swahili speakers. So I would start to move into Swahili, which was a problem for the students because they wanted a degree that was recognized in America, and my using Swahili would not help them to improve their English. Similarly, we were endeavoring to kind of orient the curriculum in order to be more relevant for Africa. Now the students discovering that this British fellow was trying to teach things that were relevant for them, and therefore not teaching in the way it was taught in America, again was a problem for the students, because what was important for them was that they had a certificate, whether it be a bachelor's or whatever, that was internationally accredited. So this became maybe increasingly difficult, but it's hard to speak to people in a language that you know has roots that are foreign to them when there's another language available in which you could make yourself much more clearly understood. Now that's partly because of my strange English accent, but also largely because when I use Swahili, I can to a greater extent use it as a holistic language rather than as a dualistic language dividing those two things. Now I don't want to mention his name, but there is a very prominent missionary in my context who, well, maybe I'm boasting here. Anyway, he praises me, let's put it that way. Now, why am I saying that? He's involved in a lot of big projects, a lot of big funding, has little opportunity to ever learn any language, and that's just his identity, and he can't get out of it. And so he appreciates that there's somebody else who avoids all projects, avoids giving out money, and therefore can be very much closer to the people and begin to communicate the gospel in a way that makes local sense. In other words, we need a complementary situation where when there are missionaries who, or ministers, whatever, maybe you're not so familiar with what we might call the missionary context. These days missionaries are less than they used to be, who do use money and have big projects, to appreciate that it's also valuable to have fellow countrymen who don't, so that you can complement one another. Now the other thing, before going back briefly to John 6:15, which I think it's important to bear in mind in the ministry context I work in, and that is envy. We have a thing called envy. And it very soon became apparent to me that the shape of envy amongst the African people I was working with was very different to the shape of envy that I'd left in the UK. And it's key and vital, it seems to me, to work out how envy functions in a community in order to know how to integrate with it. So in the communities amongst whom I work, I think the fear of envy actually reduces the things that people can freely talk about. Now, it may enable other things. Well, it does enable other things. Now, you're probably aware that envy is a power of witchcraft. And it's actually realizing how people are tied by witchcraft in Zambia that had me orient to the Bible rather than to agriculture. So, for example, if I go to someone and say, well, how many cows have you got? That's an okay question, as long as you ask it once and are immediately satisfied with the answer. But if, say, I have 1 cow, and this person says I have 10 cows, then he may fear I now have a cause to be envious of him. On the other hand, I might have 20 cows, and I ask him, how many cows have you got? And he says 2, as a way of kind of showing him how much more important I am than he is, in which case he may become envious of me. Similarly, children in school. How are your children doing? That's an okay question, but don't follow it up. Because if you follow up and maybe my children are at university and your children are getting labouring jobs, and then that is as if I'm showing off and also inviting you to bewitch me and my children, because envy is the foundation of witchcraft. So one of the lessons I had to learn was how to talk in respect, like in social context, what not to say. And I guess I can also add here that a lot of what happens in in the kind of technological world requires a dualistic distinction, which is much less prominent in African contexts, where people perhaps, now you can argue with me and throw me out if you like, envy is much more feared. Envy is much more feared. So, John 6:15, feeding of the 5,000, what does it mean? Many Western theologians are trying to work out how you can make 5 loaves into a sufficient number of loaves to feed 5,000 people. They're looking as a miracle, a supernatural event. The Jews at the time who were there were happy to be fed. But actually what Jesus, I think, was trying to communicate to those people was, you've got to eat my body and drink my blood. And even 5,000 of you, and even 10,000 of you, and even, well, everybody. Jesus' body and blood never run short. We believe in him, and drinking his blood and eating his body, or remembering the drinking and eating, okay, I mean, it's in a reformed sense, is what we should be doing. So, by conclusion, before we go to discussion, my major advocacy has been, and this is a thread running through a lot of the work that I've done. Now, I have mentioned, I have written books and articles, and if you go on to academia.edu and you look up Jim Harries, you'll find a good number of them listed there. And the core theme that runs through all those is what we call vulnerable mission, that some ministers, perhaps you can say some missionaries, we focus on Westerners, should do their prime ministry using indigenous languages and indigenous resources. So, thank you very much for listening. I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now,
may you just introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Simon from Uganda, near Kenya. Obviously, maybe next time visit Uganda, see how so welcome. We talked about some kind of challenges, like maybe learning the culture and others. How did you come about them so that you may fit in the culture and be able to do ministry amongst the people? Because you see those women who came and then at last they saw you when you were no longer giving something. And I think, sometimes they develop a certain kind of mindset, but again you had to fit yourself in that culture and then maybe you had to minister. So how did you do it? Because sometimes it might be somehow, maybe they may run from you, others come near you. So, and also another question, did you find like some challenges to fit in that society, in that culture?
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. How fit in the culture? Well, I did go to Kenya with the clear intention of not being a donor and using indigenous languages. And those two things, to me, are the means to fit into a culture. I mean, if I start with the languages, if you speak a language, it helps you to learn a language, it helps you to hear a language. When you hear people speak, you begin to understand where people are coming from, as we say in English, who people are, what is important, what's not important, what is good, what is bad. So, again, the illustration of football and tennis hopefully shows why it's not sufficient to hear them in English. If you hear them in English, you think they're playing tennis, but they're not, they're playing soccer. You only discern that when you switch language. So the use of indigenous language always with those people, so as not to create envy by speaking to someone in English and someone not, seems to me an essential beginning in order to start to get the comprehension that enables you to minister. Now, the other factor is the one of finance. I've already given illustrations of that. The widow's one is kind of a classic, but whenever you are generous, you set up a potential problem. I visit many different churches. I'm not a pastor, I don't have my own church in that sense, and I find it valuable to visit a wide variety of believers. So I do a lot of work with what we call AICs, African Indigenous Churches. Now, if I went to a particular church and was very generous to them, say I went to Marcus' church and I gave him $1,000 because they had needs in their church, and then I went to Jonathan's church and gave them $20, again, Marcus's church would say, hey, that's a bad church. They worship the devil over there. We need your money here. So people will play the game in order to keep you because you're going to be generous. But on the other hand, if you have nothing consequential to give to the church, you can visit any church and you'll be welcomed in an appropriate way. They may not give you a super welcome. You may not get a chicken that particular day. But generosity closes many doors. Let's put it like that. The difficulties in relating interculturally, you asked about that. I mean, maybe I can point again to this, the hazard of envy. And I think in many ways envy is the sin in a sense, and the topography you have to work through. People are very wary of either generating envy or of being envious. Now, it also is a game, of course, and I imagine in Uganda similarly, certainly in Kenya, if a visitor comes, someone might say, I like your shoes. Will you give me your shoes? This is envy in action, yeah? And it's a test. What's this person going to do? If he really fears envy, he'll take his shoes off and leave them. But actually it's a joke. And he should walk off making some appropriate response like, I give you my shoes, you give me the rest of your clothes. Well, walking around without clothes and only a nice pair of shoes isn't very good. So that's appropriate humor to respond to that request for your shoes. Yeah, but it's an envy humor.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. My name is Darlington. I'm from Zimbabwe. Just wanted to ask on the point that you are stressing on serving the people that you're serving in the local language and using the resources that are available to them. And I wanted to ask, particularly when you are sharing the word of God, or sharing the gospel, we know that the gospel is also presented in the context of the culture, whether it's the Greek-Roman culture, or if you're preaching from the Old Testament, it's the Hebrew culture. And so the languages that are used there, or the choice of words that are in the Bible, they carry a lot of cultural content with them, and they mean a specific thing, or they carry a certain kind of weight, if you might say. And I was wondering if you had thought about that, or kind of like wrestled with that, to maybe basically equate what you get from the scriptures with the local language. For example, let's say the Greek understanding of what the soul, the spirit, and the body is, maybe in the New Testament, and then trying to communicate that in Shona, where basically people think that it's the body and the spirit. And I was wondering if you wrestled with that. At the time when the local language maybe doesn't have enough phrases or enough words to actually communicate what the Bible says because of the culture that is embedded within the language.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think the concern you raise is very genuine. Missing terms and sometimes added terms, key terms that are not in the Bible, that you think ought to be because they're so vital for people's thriving and so on, what do you do about that? Well, but I guess my response in my position is I struggle, as do my colleagues. Now, of course, if you are, say, a Luo person and you're brought up on the Luo Bible, then you don't see some things that someone might see brought up on an English Bible. So the Bible is what it is to you. And then that raises the question, in a sense, is it the Bible? Or is it just a copy of the Bible? Now, if you believe that the Bible can be translated, and the translation process was God-inspired and Spirit-led, then it's the Bible. And if it's the Bible, then it's authoritative. So then the absence of, say, a soul, well, somehow God's going to deal with that because he's put his rubber stamp on the Bible, on the language that people understand, and you run with it. Now, if you're aware of the existence, say, of a soul, in the instance you brought, that the people are not, then, well, you can use that awareness to portray things in particular ways, but then you must also be aware that people may wonder where you're getting it from because they're not familiar with it. So I think my short answer is, or maybe it's a long one, I don't know. I mean, I'm learning from my Luo colleagues. I'll be frank. Sometimes when I've preached, they'll say, or maybe often, well, some of you might have understood what Jim said. What he says is always difficult to understand, but we've got something, I'm sure. Now, when I stand up and preach or teach, at the end, people kind of look appreciative and I sit back down. Many of my colleagues, when they stand up to teach and preach, at the end, everyone's on their knees crying. So I fall far short. And I'm trying to imitate them. Now, not everyone has to be on their knees, but yet that's there. And one source of it, when the Bible talks about, don't ask me about Greek or Hebrew, but crying, in the Luo it says, yuagrok. And yuagrok is crying out loud. So people like to cry loudly, not just cry quietly. But then this is widespread. I don't know about here in South Africa, but when I go to Tanzania and when I'm in Kenya, in different tribes, I hear churches and they're shouting loudly. So there's content in the African culture and language that's not there in the Western one.
I'm Jimmy Paul, I'm with DRC, I'm French speaking, so just want to ask a question, a couple of questions, try to summarize. The first one, how do you define Africans? Who are Africans to you? And also, who are the primary targets of the gospel? Are they the less educated, or who are those Africans compared to educated and those who have something? And it appears that the more educated Africans are causing more harm to Africans than the less educated.
Thank you very much. Now, in kind of definitional terms, I tend to say Africans to mean people with black skin color or dark skin color who were born and raised in Africa. That's perhaps the general term. Now, I'm aware that, like here in South Africa, we have terms like coloureds and so on that we don't have in East Africa. So basically, you're African or you're Indian and or you're a white person, and those latter categories are a few people, and the mass fall into the African category. Now, I've already mentioned I don't go along with the strength of the condemnation of generalization that is put into academic writing these days. I think the condemnation of generalization, and the classic one is Africans, is being used actually to empower, here you go, Europe. So the category ought to be used more than it is. And you can look at my materials on the web that I've talked about if you want to find more about that. Search for generalization, you know. So, yeah, in the Kenyan people refer to themselves as African. That's another thing. So if I'm talking, if I'm engaged in an indigenous discourse, I say You are the African, I'm the Mzungu. We say Mulungu here. That's their own category. They don't say we're Kenyan, well, they might do, but very often they say we're African. There's another cause for that. The target and the distinction between the educated and the uneducated African, well, that's an intriguing one. And what I'm suggesting is that it's much easier for a Westerner to communicate with those who don't really know English, because English creates a confusion that what is football sounds like tennis. So when I engage with people who know Swahili or Luo and might be highly educated, I much rather speak to them in Luo or Swahili than in English. My English is rooted in England, and frankly it's vastly different to Kenyan English. But my Luo is rooted in Kenya, and my Swahili I learn in East Africa. So when I use those languages, I can connect much more closely with the local people.
Sir? Hi, Chair. We kept on talking about envy as one of the problems, and later as a basis for a lot of problems. So with trust, I'd like to push a little more on that. Because of that, you have deliverance ministries, a lot of them back home. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that. So you have someone running away from one community to another, hoping that by being in this other community, say community A to community B, being that coming to community B, you're running away from something more like a retreat, a place of safety, which many churches, so to speak, would claim to provide. So we will pray, and by praying, maybe we'll deal with whatever fears that you have talked about, envy again. And then you have another community that looks at community C, that looks at community B, and say, hey, that is all wrong. So that would be your reform camp that looks at all of these things and say, that is all wrong, you need to come to this community. I don't know whether you're getting where I'm going with the question. So you have three communities. One is a community where witchcraft is practiced. Community B is what we call the prosperity teaching. They claim to deliver people. Recently I was with Kwasi in Nairobi, and he actually said, let's not call it prosperity gospel. It's not gospel at all. We're going to call it prosperity teaching. You could have community C that says all of that is wrong, comes to us. How do you engage with that? And this is of course like you have a lot of people like in Uganda recently, probably you had, the biggest sin ever committed was homosexuality. It was being discussed. No one talks about envy. And yet, when you, on the grassroots, this, I agree with you, is a serious issue that is worth thinking about. So you have culture, tradition, and all of that. Language is at play as well. And when you talk about language, just to go back to what Darlington was asking, up till now I'm struggling to find an equivalent for sin, the word sin. So we're talking deliverance, but I'm still struggling with finding the equivalent word. As I understand it in English, in Uganda or any other language, what sin is. Hence, when we talk of deliverance, from a reform perspective, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by deliverance? And yeah, I'd just like to hear what you say.
Thank you very much indeed, and very many good questions.
Well, there's 8 or 9 questions.
Yeah, right. Well, I was told they're going to lock the door. We'll be here till at least 5 o'clock. What deliverance means to reform, someone in the Reformed tradition, I think I can say I don't know. My short observation on Reformed is that in my home area, we don't really have Reformed. I like Reformed theology. It's not a reflection of what I do or don't like. there's a few small outposts of Reformed teaching, but people struggle. Now, of course, what exactly you mean by Reformed and so on, I get the impression people struggle to understand what's going on, because they're looking for cleansing, and that's connected to African worldview, which is a power worldview, and so on and so forth. Regarding sin, I mean, in the Luo language, the absence of sin prompted the Bible translators to find a word, and they use a plural for bad to represent sin. It is ritual. Now, of course, in usage, the people readjust sin back to the actual, what they understand to be doing wrong, which is breaking the taboos of the ancestors. So you can devise a word, but the usage of the word will take it back to its linkage with the ancestral commands. It's hard to, if you'd ask one at a time, the witchcraft, prosperity. Prosperity, okay, if I put it this way, I taught part-time 15 years at a Bible college, a bit like this one, perhaps up to degree level, and when the students preached to their fellow students and the teachers, they would have nice 3-point sermons. When I took the student to the villages, they would tell the people, you will prosper. And if you don't, then it's like you hate the people. I mean, one explained to me, he's Ugandan, actually said, well, I tried to go, and I said, you probably won't prosper. What? You know, it didn't work. Now, I think I don't teach prosperity gospel, but of course, one of the reasons for not using a lot of money is so as to not to live the prosperity gospel, because it's very easy for someone of European origins to live the prosperity gospel if they don't teach it. So you show up in your car and you teach the gospel of sacrifice, get back in your car and go to the top hotel. Well, people are kind of wondering, well, what does this mean? And so on. So the prosperity is there. Those Christian leaders who are in my home community, I assess in different ways they are prosperity teachers, and I don't know how else to do it, because that's where the people kind of are. And that links in with a massive divergence across the board with, let's say, mainstream English language thinking. For example, the one church leader promotes development. Now, to me as a Brit raised in England, I know development is about fertilizers and economics, but he has a very different view of development rooted in God's provision. So it's a very tough nut to crack. Let's leave it like that.
Oh my goodness. Okay, let's try. I think we'll have these four. Let's try and move through the questions, because I'm aware some of you will have to go and yeah, so let's move through these four questions.
I left from Calcutta. My question is on your tips on generosity. That you find some difficulties with generosity, and you say generosity is sometimes closer to money than it is true. But how do you connect what in my mind seems to be a tension? And maybe let me put it in my context in South Sudan. I don't know, I'm not being clear. So there would be a tension between people's expectation of pastor, that the home of pastor is supposed to be open doors for people to come and maybe, and you are also expected to be generous to people. So how do you actually harmonize that with beauty now to abstain from further problems? So you want to not be generous. So how do you harmonize those things? There seems to be tension in one.
Right. Thank you very much. I mean, immediately, I think it's, I'm an outsider to the community, and people understand me in a certain way, so it's more important for me not to help widows, but it might be quite different for a local pastor to help widows. And of course, the question is how you help them, but I think for a foreign missionary, not to get themselves into traps, it's particularly important to orient them away from responding to people's pleas for compassion too quickly. Yeah, I think that's it, yeah, okay.
And that's maybe something to highlight again. I mean, you're speaking as a foreign missionary,
right.
and you're talking about vulnerable missions, as opposed to this is how a local person should minister in their own context.
Right.
So it's those expectations and that you're trying to address and do away with them on.
Yep.
Okay,
That question I also wanted to ask on generosity as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, what might it look like for a wealthy individual or organisation, particularly of Western origin, who are looking to support the global church, particularly in the global south, in a way that is potentially healthy? Or maybe to reword the question, is it possible for a church, organisation, individual who is wealthy Westerner to support the church in the global south?
Thank you. Just to confirm what Jonathan said, yes, as I indicated, I don't understand Africans sufficiently to give them this kind of instruction. But I'm also aware, I presume in South Africa, like in Kenya, all formal discourse has to be as if it's to Americans, basically. You don't write things in respect to African culture in a formal sense. So I'm forced into the same predicament of telling Africans what is appropriate for Westerners, and this seems to happen a great deal. And I'm certainly not saying all Western missions or everybody must not be generous. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying if you want to relate closely with people, then if you're at the same time using a lot of money that is upsetting them or pulling them to be your your people, they're stuck to you as their patron, that's problematic and it creates difficulties in ministry. So what about the wealthy church or the wealthy donors? Question I'm hearing here from Adam. My own view would be to say we are desperately short not of wealthy people, we're desperately short of people who are ready to die for Christ. Now, is that a correct theology or not? But the Bible doesn't only say Jesus died for us, our job is to rejoice. Our role is to give ourselves as Christ gave himself. And he gave himself unto death. Now these days, a lot of people from the Western context working in Africa, and I don't blame them, and I'm not saying they're wrong to do so, but they want to make sure, well, I must have a car, and I must have a house which must have security, and then there needs to be electricity, and my children have to go to good school, so I need a computer, and then I need to be near the airport, and all these things which are vastly expensive. And to get behind or around those things is difficult. One thing that is a major help I've indicated is celibacy, and I think there has to be more of a role for celibate service. But that does bring its own temptations, of course. You need those people who can stand up to those temptations. I actually work under the wing of the Coptic Orthodox Church. I haven't mentioned that. I'm not Coptic or Orthodox, but they brought me under their wing, and they have a very high valuation of celibate service, which actually helps me. They understand what I'm doing, if you like. Now, those who have a lot of money and want to help the poor with it, I think they have a difficult task on their hands. And in some ways, I don't know how to advise them. In other ways, I would re-emphasize, okay, if there are 10 missionaries who are raising as many funds as possible to help the poor, let there be one or two who don't do that, who are there to relate on a level. And that has implications for relationships between the two. Because if, say, Marcus is that wealthy missionary, and I go to Marcus and I'm a close friend, he has to decide who to help, for example. I know the people. Then the people think, well, I've told him what to do. So in some respects, the missionary who wants to be vulnerable, as we're describing it, local languages, local resources, has to be polite to, but avoid close contact with those who have a lot of resources to give out. And that just seems to be the reality. I mean, you can look at the models of the prophets of the Old Testament who people tended not to like, because instead of providing business and thriving, they were telling people you're sinners and all this kind of thing, you know. So maybe we're falling a little bit into that category.
Hi, my name is Rachel. From Kenya. So I understand that the people you're working with are known for, apart from the country, they are known for their status and such. And I know that with that, they are known for their English and such things. I don't know if I actually located within the Grohmann, but I was looking at that as a challenge maybe in terms of the people you're dealing with and their lack of status and their lack of we know them before, and how that would be a challenge maybe if you're trying to communicate to them with using Swahili or using Luo, and maybe the reason you want to be so you think most of the time you communicate to them using Swahili and Luo. But then I'm looking at the gap, I don't know the gap of people you're working with, and I know right now speaking in Swahili is very difficult, especially in the rural Kenya right now. How do you bridge the gap between the young people who feel Swahili language is like boarding language, so they want to be communicated to in English, and the people who feel like you are degrading them when you communicate them?
Now, I don't think I'm degrading people by using an indigenous language. If they think that, now people tell me in Nairobi, someone said, Jim, don't talk to people in Swahili, they think you're going to offend people. I talk Swahili, and if they're offended, well, that's kind of, I don't know what to do about that. Now, in terms of the young people who don't have this attraction to Swahili, well, I think in many respects, Kenyans, of course, don't have the problem that I have. Kenyans speaking English is very different from me speaking English, because Kenyans learn their English in Kenya, and there is Kenyan English, and it grows out of, it's connected to the indigenous languages. So in many respects, although I think it's still a problem, but in many respects, English amongst Kenyans is kind of, well, okay. But the problem is for an outsider, particularly an outsider who's a native English speaker, I mean, raised in the UK. So I can't engage those contexts, because it'll soon either have me be a hypocrite perhaps, or what I found I was doing when I was teaching English, a student would ask a question and I'd have to tell a long story about the history of England in order to explain the meaning of this word. But I wasn't there to teach English, I was there to teach God's word. So in that respect, English remains extremely problematic. I mean, in the educational system, you know, technically Kenya uses British English. Now I think recently, I may be wrong, but I understand Britain said 1,000 nurses can go to England and about 20 pass the English exam. But English is widely used in Kenya, but it's Kenyan English, you see. And you know in Nairobi it gets mixed up with Swahili all the time, we get Shengs and so on and so forth. So the problem of English is particularly for a foreign missionary. In many respects, as a foreign missionary, I'm happy to leave the educated, the high-flying youth to other people to minister to, because I struggle to do so. And frankly, as a foreign missionary, I should stay low level and not high level. Now here I've come to teach people who are doing master's degrees or whatever. I don't do this in Kenya. I don't see how. And in fact, I didn't want to do it in South Africa. You can ask Marcus, he kind of kept pulling me. Okay, so I'm here speaking English to you, which I hate doing, because I know it's like a trap. You'll fault me, I'm wrong. Yes, I'm wrong because I use different English. And you can't get around that. And then because Kenyans use English, which belongs to America, it constantly brings them up against this tension. They want to do with the language what they want to, make it their language, but they can't, because other people are controlling it. So a lot of issues there. And I think I need to stay at the level of the people who are, if you like, less educated. They use Luo and Swahili, and I smile.
Last question. Yeah, my name is Job, and thank you so much for the work that you have been in Kenya, the Gospel Ministry. And as I learned a lot through church history and the spread of Christianity in 18th, 17th, and 19th century and 20th century in Africa, most of the missionaries come from the UK, and they evangelize and preach the gospel in Africa. And what I have realized is that most of them, or none of them, married in Africa. And that has a lot of questions being asked, because if they truly come to Africa and preach the gospel and don't marry in Africa, and then there's a sense that the intention is clear, but what is that to prevent you from marrying other Christians? And it's the same thing that is happening to some missionaries in Africa like you. So it's the same thing that is happening to you in our century. And most of African countries, value marriage so much. And marriage is the key in the Bible. Even Christ Jesus married the church. And though Paul argued that it's a personal choice to leave singles is well, but why is it that most of Western missionaries don't marry Africa?
Right.
Is it a choice? Is it a culture? Is it a what? And then, what is your view along that?
Well, I can refer us back to envy, and I don't know how to say this in a way, because I don't like saying it in English anyway. Envy in Africa, to me, is shocking. I think there's a respect in which you can say envy is God. And it's very difficult to work with this envy. Now, I don't, in another sense, blame people because they're not dualists. And we were not, I think, as Europeans many years ago. There's very clear ways for us as Europeans to generate money and to generate resources. We just know how to do it. Many of my African friends seem not to know. So they have to get it from somebody else. And they get it from somebody else by the process of envy. You make people feel bad because you need it. Now, as I say, this is, you can say this, our lecture today was terrible if you want to, but this is a big problem. Now, how does that relate to marriage? If missionaries do struggle with this, I think the right model for a missionary is to live with their wife and children in a context in which they can maintain a kind of a Western way of life, assuming they're Western missionaries, and then they cross a line and go into ministry into another context in which they do not have money and they only use the local language. But the preference of the people very often is, you've come from a wealthy country, you share what you have with us, which then puts a lot of pressure on the family, either to live behind big walls or to bring in more and more money so you can justify your way of life while helping the people, or to leave. And people leave. Because they feel bad. How can we be eating like this and living like this when those people have nothing? But why do those people have nothing? Well, you can look at witchcraft and you can look at envy, and they're very closely related. Because envy is not trust. Envy is the opposite of trust. Now, I concede, I wouldn't know what envy was if I wasn't envious. Yeah, I'm envious. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to identify this. I do agree it's a horror in another way for Western missionaries to come to Africa to minister, to say, I love you folks, I love you, and to marry a Brit and then disappear, and the children go back to America. I mean, that shouldn't be happening. And I'm not wanting to blame this side or that side in a way. Intercultural marriage is difficult. If I think to myself, if I was to marry an African lady, then many of her family would want benefit from that. How can you be married to a Brit and you live like this in a village? No, that's not right. You should make sure he gives you things. And if she goes to Britain, they'll tell her the same thing. They won't say, no, it's best for Jim and you to live poor. No, they'll say, yeah, of course you should give money to those people, because they don't understand the need for vulnerable mission either. Why don't they understand it? Well, maybe because they haven't realized how powerful envy is. And if you use money, people become envious, and if the witchcraft doesn't work, the envy nevertheless is in the community. It's very hard for people to accept that this person is wealthy and living in this standard of life and I don't benefit. Now that's universal, but yet the power of this ethic, you must help us, in Africa is extreme, if you like. And it kind of pushes foreigners away because they never give enough. And as I indicated, if you give differentially, which you have to, I can't give the same to everybody. Okay, if I said everyone who's in this lecture room, I'll give them $10, then a student would come to me and said, you know, I was going to come to your lecture, but I couldn't. I want the $10, you know. If you start giving, it's always partial. You're always giving some people more than others or less than others. And I think this underlies a great deal of the, the driving out of demons and the African spirituality, even especially the African poverty. People fear envy so much that they conceal their wealth and are generous to their family, and so on.
Thank you again, Jim. The talk raised questions and answered other questions, and your questions raised more questions. We got answers and more. So this is part of an ongoing discussion. Those of you who heard Marcus speak earlier this year or last year have been part of this discussion. So this isn't the end of the discussion. We'll continue these discussions going forward. And as we've heard, this is incredibly important, as your questions have indicated as well. So thank you again. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, family.